Greetings, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to attend and clicking on this lecture. We're going to be talking about teaching children who are deaf and hard of hearing and critically dissecting the issues that, intersect between the ability to hear and your access to education. My name is Vera Genevi Tlaisi. I'm an audiology lecturer and researcher at the University of Cape Town. That is my email there at the bottom. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions or if you'd like to know more about a particular area that I'm going to be in the many things I'm chatting to you about. And also if you are more interested in audiology as well as hearing and deafness as a smaller subsection to this bigger short course that you are all doing. Let us get started. In this lecture, we are going to go through three main areas. We're going to tackle what is a hearing loss or deafness or hard of hearing. What is that? What does that mean? What does that look like? How is it measured? How is it determined? Who determines it? What does it impact? And when we start unpacking, what does hearing loss impact, we're going to look at hearing and learning. What is the intersection between these two? Are they parallel? What does one take from the other? What does one need from the other? And so on and so forth. And then last, we really are going to be unpacking some of the classroom accommodations for deaf children and adults as well, depending on what your subpopulation is that you are looking to be working with. And so we're going to start with unpacking hearing loss. What is it? What does that look like? From the slide, that's what we are going to go into next. And so hearing loss, as defined by the World Health Organization, is essentially a medical condition or a disability that is based on you not being able to access sound. And the World Health Organization, in their definition, have covered the nature and the type of hearing loss, how severe it is, the laterality, meaning what side, seeing that there are two ears, is it the left side or the right side? And then they've also looked at the configuration, and that's mostly the clinical configuration, that when we measure it with an audiogram, what does that look like? And an audiogram is simply a diagram that we as audiologists put together after measuring your ears to just draw it out, and that kind of drawing is what the configuration is describing. I'll go more in depth into all of these. I just wanted to show you in this slide that we're going to then cover, the definitions. We're going to cover what an audiogram looks like and what are the clinical definitions of hearing loss. And then last, we're going to tackle some of the clinical symptoms and indications of hearing loss in children. As indicated in the previous slide, hearing loss is partial or a total inability to hear. And it is diagnosed or determined by a test that audiologists do. So like I said in my introduction slide, I'm an audiologist, but because I'm an academic and in research, I don't necessarily do those anymore. But as a qualified audiologist, I'm a person who is certified to do a hearing sensitivity test to then determine if you have a hearing loss or not. And in that hearing sensitivity test, that's what we then take those results and we put them in what we call an audiogram. Not the most creative use of a name. It's just a diagram of the audio test that we would have done. And it'll illustrate the results and help us classify the type of loss and also how severe it is. And speaking of classifications, in the next slide, I'll then show you what are the different classification systems that we use for hearing loss and some of the things that you might encounter if you're looking at a clinical report or just a report or school entry form or application form for a child with a hearing loss. And here are the classification systems. So you have classification in terms of type, meaning what kind of a hearing loss is it, and there are 3 different types that I will explore in the next slide. And then we look at severity. There's 4 main severity levels that a hearing loss can be. I'll also do that in the follow-up slide after I talk about types. And then lastly, there's the laterality, meaning is it in one ear and we call it unilateral, or is it in both ears? We call that bilateral. So I'll cover each and every one of these, but I just thought it would be nice to give you an overview of the classification systems. There's a type, there's a severity, and there's a laterality. There are 3 types of hearing loss, and looking at the infographic there, you will see that the first one in the blue is a sensory neural hearing loss. This is usually the permanent kind of hearing loss. This is a hearing loss where your sensory or your neural organs are affected, hence the name sensory neural. And if we look at the image next to it, it is that yellow shaded area where you can see it in the inner ear, where the hearing organ is, as well as where the nerves are for the ear. If that part of the ear is affected, then you will have what we call a sensory neural hearing loss. And it's permanent because to date we haven't found necessarily a cure or a method to reverse that kind of a hearing loss, and so it is a permanent kind of hearing loss. Then in the next bit, we have a conductive hearing loss. That's in the green bit. It's usually called a temporary hearing loss because what usually happens in a conductive hearing loss is in that white area that you see in the ear there, when there's an issue with how the sound is conducted from your eardrum or through your ear canal to your eardrum right down to the middle ear, the red section there, if there's maybe a blockage, if there's fluid, if there's anything there, usually an ear, nose, and throat surgeon can remove that, or ear, nose, and throat specialist can then prescribe medication to take some of that infection or fluid away. They can even drain some of the fluid, because that red area that you see there in the middle ear through the eustachian tube there at the bottom connects to your nose. And with most children, if you have any kind of snot or kind of flu or viral infection, you end up having an ear infection, which should, in the simple sense, be able to be cured. But if we look at our context in South Africa, not everybody has access to audiologists and ENTs for the ear infection to be diagnosed in time and healed in time. Not everybody has access to sanitation and hygiene. Not everybody has access to health care, number one, never mind to specialized services like audiology and ear, nose, and throat specialists. And so sometimes these things go unnoticed and they are recurrent. And also, if you look at our context, we have a lot of children in the continent, and this is just not specific to South Africa, that are struggling with other bigger lifelong infections such as HIV, TB, and many other issues that then make children much more susceptible to conductive losses. That's why it's most common in children. And then when we start talking about a mixed hearing loss, you're looking at a hearing loss that is affecting the conduction of the sound as well as the nerves and the sensory organs. So the problem can be in any of the areas or in all of the areas. It can happen in such a manner. And so when we are classifying hearing loss according to the types, that is what we are talking about. And so if you see a report saying conductive hearing loss, in a child, oh, okay, this is a loss that, usually is temporary, but we say temporary because there is an ability to cure it. But in actual action, it may not necessarily be curable because it just reoccurs so often, and so on and so forth. So now I'm going to show you another slide where we're going to talk about the hearing severity. And here we are on the slide. We have the picture version of what I've been alluding to, the audiogram. On the y-axis, you've got the decibels from the tippity top there in yellow, from -10 going all the way down to 120. We've got the decibels that mean the loudness of the sound. And on the x-axis, we've got what we as audiologists call frequencies, but it's really just a pitch of the sound, meaning from the left hand side we have the lowest pitch of sound that we're trying to capture, what your ear hears at what level, all the way to the right hand side where it goes to the highest pitch. I'm trying to, give you a sound example as you're listening, but everything in between. And in this audiogram, we cover everything and we make a drawing, and that's where the configuration comes in, and also the determination of the actual level or severity from normal, mild, moderate, severe to profound. And on the right hand side, we've got the noise levels. I put a picture there to help you look at the noise level. So for example, something that's at 30 decibels, it's like the sound of a soft whisper. And if you look at the opposite on the other side, where 106 decibels is the sound of a leaf blower or a chainsaw, or maybe a car race, a gunshot, that's just, the range of what our ears can hear or not. Because when you're sitting at profound hearing loss, it means you couldn't hear a gunshot if it was shot next to you. You might feel the vibration, but in terms of sense of hearing, if you have a profound hearing loss, you would not be able to hear that. In this slide, you just have a image version of what the World Health Organization grades hearing loss as in terms of decibels. So similar to the color coding that you saw in the previous slide in the audiogram, here they have it in a nice infographic on how they classify disabling hearing loss. Now, when we start talking about disabling, we start alluding to functional impact of the hearing loss on the child or the adult. What are the functions that are impaired, that are not necessarily effective or able to be used or accessed because of the hearing loss? And according to World Health Organization, they take anything above 40 decibels as a disabling hearing loss, and there's different grading systems, but I thought it would be important to share with you the World Health Organization grading system. And of course, this is a nice, easily accessible image because it's color coded and it's pretty, and especially if we're talking about children and the school space. Now, the terminology in our field is quite varied. I'm not sure as to the reason for this, the amount of terms that are used to describe hearing loss or hearing condition, but I just thought it would be important to conscientize you to the various naming or nomenclature that you might find that are actually referring to the same thing. The one thing I want to highlight is that very last bullet where you see deaf with a capital D and deaf with a small caps D. Now that is not the same as the rest of them, especially in the South African context. The capital D refers to deaf culture and identity as informed by a set of social beliefs, behaviors, traditions, and there's quite a lot of history. And as a people, deaf people have their own shared institutions and communities that influence some of their languages and how they relate to one another. And it's not necessarily looking at them just as they have a hearing disability. No, they identify as deaf people and they communicate using sign language. And in South Africa, it is called South African Sign Language because it is different. In different regions, you have different versions of sign language, as you do with any other language. So you would have American Sign, you have International Sign, you've got South African Sign. So I just wanted to conscientize everybody to the fact that D with a capital on deaf means something different to D with a small cap. I tried to include it in the small text there at the bottom, so I hope you can read that and be aware of the key differences in the naming. The academic in me could not, prepare a small lecture without giving the context of the prevalence the numbers, what are we looking at? How many people have hearing loss and how many people are affected? It's very easy to go by unseen because it is technically called an invisible disability, because it's not like a physical or cognitive or any other disability that is easy to see or identify just by looking at a person. And so almost 500 million people worldwide actually have disabling hearing loss, and of those just over 30 million are children. And these numbers are of course compiled through research, and they're not necessarily always the most accurate representation of the numbers in every single region of the world. I believe in South Africa we have a higher number, or in Africa we have a higher number. It's just it may be undocumented, and worse yet, it may be undiagnosed. So those are just some numbers for you to have a look at and give you context of how big the problem is in terms of scale as it relates to the rest of the world. And to match the global prevalence numbers, I thought it might be useful to provide you with some regional prevalence. Just a caution, they are a little bit old because we are mostly doing population-based numbers or population-based prevalence statistics in line with the census. Excuse me, I do have a bit of a flu as I'm recording this for you. So the numbers, like I was saying, are a bit older because we are waiting for the most recent census. I believe it's been happening in the last year or two, and actually still is happening in South Africa now in 2022. So just to give you a regional look as well into the numbers. I think, when we start looking at the term disabling, it's a very it's a loaded term for the lack of a better way of describing it, and I've alluded before when I was talking about the severity of the loss that numerically or clinically, when we are diagnosing a hearing loss, we say anything above 40 decibels is disabling. But when we actually start talking about a person and the people who live with deafness and who are deaf or who have a hearing loss, what actually makes the hearing loss disabling? So if you look at, for example, the functional aspects of what do you actually use your hearing for, because when you start asking that question, then you start unpacking the things that you will not have access to, or the things that will be made more difficult for you to function. So for example, you and I today are engaging in an educational activity using technology asynchronously because you are able to hear the English language, you're able to access information through written language and through spoken language. And so functionally, if you had a hearing loss, you would need some assistive devices to help you access the information that I'm providing right now through my voice. And so your access to knowledge, your access to education, your interaction with technology, your interaction with the world, if you actually think about it, because communication on the biggest part is a hearing activity. It's a hearing function. And so just from the get, functionally, communication is the biggest thing that will become a challenge. But also, if you think about the social implications of you not being able to hear appropriately, it goes to, are you able to follow group conversation? Are you able to follow when you are having connections with people and there's background noise? Then you have to start thinking about every time you go to a restaurant, every time you use a phone, every time you are attending a musical concert, when you are driving, when you are learning a new song, when anything that you are doing as a human being, you tend to realize you actually need your hearing and your ability to connect to a hearing world, and a world that is filled with so many sounds. Even a walk. Some of the reasons why a walk is calming and relaxing is because you can hear the nature, you can hear the birds, and you are in silence because you choose to be in silence, as opposed to the alternative where you're not able to interact with nature because you cannot hear the birds, you cannot hear the rustling leaves. And I mean, I could go on and on about what are the smaller things and the bigger things that makes hearing loss disabling to those that are living with it. And then lastly, when you look at the economical impact, for example, if you are working at a call center, if you're unable to hear and and there are no necessary technology and accommodations and interventions that are made available to you, it becomes very hard to function at a call center where, for example, majority of what you're doing, you're listening through a phone or listening through a headphone, which in and of itself has its own issues, even for hearing people. We sometimes struggle to hear people on the other side because of network, because of connectivity. Now, if you add a hearing loss to that, it excludes you to many economic opportunities. And also, if we start thinking about certain jobs where your hearing is actually part of your safety, if you think about being a long distance driver, if you even think about driving at all, you don't know it when you have the ability to hear, but a lot of what you use to be able to tell whether you're safe, whether there's another car behind you, whether there's danger, or is your car sounding okay, do you have a puncture, you are actually using your sense of hearing and your sense of vision, as well as the rest of your body and your mind as well, of course, to function in terms of the skill. But if you are a driver and you're not able to hear, actually in some sectors they do what we call medical examination tests, and you are then declared unfit for work. Certain things like being a mining engineer, or in mining, it is required that you're able to hear in order for you to be declared fit, among other health related assessments that they do. So the economical impact is huge, because your ability to function in the economic market is reduced unless it is then assisted by intervention and rehabilitation, which is where the audiologist would come in. And if you look at a child on the opposite end, if you're unable to access communication, there's certain things that affect your learning and your education system, which is what I'm going to chat to you about shortly in the next slide. But then it also impedes your economic potential and what are the things that you're able to reach when you grow up with a particular hearing loss. And so what makes a hearing loss disabling, unfortunately, is the environment, the society, the systems, because they are geared for people who are able to hear and not the other way around. So it could be an issue of inclusivity, where the design of most things in the world were designed for hearing able people. And so when you're not able to hear, the environment around you, the society around you, the systems around you disable you as a person with a hearing loss. Now, we're at the crux, we're at the meaty bit of why you and I are engaging today. What makes hearing loss disabling for children? What are the issues that are impacted in a child's developmental journey when they have a hearing loss? Well, ladies and gentlemen, I've alluded to it. Hearing is how we connect with the world, because the world is a hearing world and is a hearing society and environment, on the most part, on the majority part. When you take away that ability to a child, their ability to learn communication on a linguistic level in terms of speech and language development is then delayed. Because if you think about if you've been exposed to children, or if you have your own in your family, it takes a typically developing child almost 12 months of listening and hearing and encoding a language, whether you're speaking isiZulu, isiXhosa, Afrikaans, French, Spanish, English. It takes a child almost 12 months of listening and hearing and just being exposed to that audition and that sound of a language for them to even start mimicking one word. And that's in a typically developing child. Now, when you don't have full access to listening and to encoding and decoding the language that you have access to via sound, then you are delayed. So, for example, the reason why we sound how we sound is because our brains and our hearing organs spent years encoding this information, and then we learn how to then produce the same information. And even that learning process, when you are talking, you're able to hear yourself back, and you're able to then make corrections to how you sound, your prosody, your intonation, all of those things in terms of communication and language and engagement are a skill that you learn through the ability to hear. Because a lot of language and a lot of communication is verbal. It doesn't mean that if you do have a hearing loss, however, you cannot communicate and you cannot engage. No, you can, but then it has to be assisted, or it has to be visual, and that's where something like sign language comes in. But all of these things need to happen if we enable early identification of the hearing loss, if we enable inclusive systems for children when they are young, in the early communication development and in early childhood development centers, for them to then be inclusive in their design, such that if a child has a hearing loss or a vision loss, or an intellectual difficulty, we are able to then catch those children early and enable them what we like to call catch-up growth through assistance and rehabilitation. And I would hope through people like you and I who are engaged in topics like this, we're able to also do the same for children with disabling hearing loss. And to that last bit about social, emotional, and behavioral effects, or even scholastic and academic impact, when you are not able to participate in an environment where everything is presented through sound and you don't have access to that sound, you are then often misdiagnosed as a child who misbehaves, a child who's not attentive, a child who sometimes, I've seen cases where children are labeled as the ADHD child, or, there must be problems at home, or, everyone is trying to, put a label on you, because sometimes lack of understanding and knowledge and access to the information that perhaps this child is not seeing what I'm writing on the board. Perhaps this child is not even able to hear anything, or they have a partial hearing loss and they're not able to access the sound, hence they're acting out. And some children are tagged with behavioral issues when in fact it's a hearing loss that has been either undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. And with the correct assistance and proper accommodation in the classroom and in the learning or even education system, we're able to reach to that child and provide the scholastic support that might be needed. Now, in the next slide, I'm going to share even more on the effect of hearing loss on the actual ability to learn. So I don't know how many of us are aware that our ability to read is in fact encoded in our brains through the ability to hear. I'll quickly unpack. How many of us know the song A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, right? Now, I'm sure all of you might have sang the song, heard of the song, or in many ways were taught the song first before you attached the sound to what the letter looked like. Now, this is what we call speech perception. You first are taught how to perceive sound, and then you are then taught how to attach that sound of speech or a syllable to a written phoneme. We call it a written phoneme because, if you think back to how you were taught in nursery school or even in primary school, they would teach you a, e, I, o, u, right down to how you see the mouth and the speech production processes happening in the face. And obviously we were taught through repetition, but that is the entire process of phonemic awareness. Now, if you're not able to hear, this entire exercise precludes you from being able to associate what you hear to what you see visually, which is the written language, right? And so a ba to you doesn't mean ba that you see on the written paper. A ba to you might just be what you feel in terms of your lips vibrate instead of you hearing the sound ba. And if you take out that entire system of teaching children literacy and the ability to read through sound, you then have to stop and think, oh wait, but how else do we teach them? Then you stop and you think of, oh, what happens to children who can't see? Even if you can hear, if you can't see the letters, oh, you need to feel. What does that introduce into the learning system? It introduces sensory learning. Sensory learning meaning you use touch, you use feeling, and you use all of their senses outside of their vision to teach them, right? If you think of Braille, if you're aware of Braille. But the point I'm trying to make here is language development, speech perception, literacy, all of that, as it stands, to my current knowledge and understanding in the education system, is based on your ability to access sound. It could be in any language, whether you're being taught Chivenda or you are being taught Swahili. You are first taught access to that language through sound. Then they teach you how to attach the sound to the written version of the visual sound. And then you are taught the fine motor skill to then attach to you being able to write. Now, your access to reading and writing, we all know what that impacts in future. But if you're not able to attach yourself to the ability to identify the sound and attach the sound to the written literacy language, you already are at a gap and you're already going to experience a delay. Now, in this slide, you will see that there's a link to a YouTube video. I want you to take your time maybe after this and watch that video and see what I'm talking about when I talk about phonemic awareness and how it is used in the education system as it stands to facilitate literacy. Now, all of this is good and well, but we need to then start thinking about what are the learning adaptations that we need to introduce into the education system to provide access to that sound for those that do not have it because they have a hearing loss, because this is then going to affect their ability to learn. I have shared with you a resource, and a few resources. The first two are articles that explain more and go into more depth about hearing loss and learning, and teaching systems and education systems for children who are deaf. And I want you to take your time and have a look at those readings. Obviously, they're suggested; they're not imposed on you. But if you want to know more and delve into this, have a look at that. But I want us to spend time quickly on a worksheet that provides some guidance on how could you begin to accommodate a child that has a hearing loss in a classroom, or even an adult that has a hearing loss in a learning environment, or even in an engagement where you are in a group setting. So I'll quickly stop the narration on this slide so we can go on to the follow-up slides as our time is running out. I also thought it important to just put a disclaimer that I am aware that the first reading is a bit older, but I like that reading because it gives you the background on the considerations in educating deaf and hard of hearing students, particularly what does that mean when you say in an inclusive setting? What is an inclusive setting? I just thought, I'm not just going to put it there and you're going to look and be like, oh my God, giving us, a suggested reading from 1999. I know it's old, but these are some of the fundamentals and pioneering, literature from the Journal of Deaf Studies and Deaf Education. And I really, really like it also because it's short, it's easy to read and get through. The second one is more recent, but it's a thesis in bicultural and bilingual education. I wanted to expose you to some of the terminology that you might come across in this kind of work or in this kind of field, because if you remember, I spoke about capital D for deaf, meaning and alluding to identity and culture. And so when you start looking at language and how you communicate as part of a culture, when you're exposing a deaf child to the hearing world and hearing systems, you are entering a world of biculturalism and bilingualism, because they will, inadvertently be exposed to a verbal language or a hearing language as well as a visual language if, they do choose to communicate using sign language. So if you do have the time, have a quick squiz through those readings and hopefully they will enrich your knowledge into the topic area with more depth and richness. And some of the questions that I would hope that you're going to walk away from this lecture asking yourself is, what are the issues that I, in my particular field of practice, field of knowledge, field of exposure, and just my sphere of influence, what are the issues that I should be aware of? What are the challenges? Now that I have a glimpse of an understanding of how much we actually use our hearing, and how, for example, if you're a child or an adult in a learning system, how are you impacted? And I think just by virtue of asking that kind of question, you're already setting yourself in the right path to look at how can we make education inclusive for children with hearing loss. So these are just some of the issues or some of the questions I hope you ask yourself, and you start engaging and discussing within, some of the participants in this short course. The other thing I really wanted to conscientize everybody to is, some of the legal documents, the policy documents, government documents that are available that cover, what inclusive education should look like, how does the intersection of human rights and constitutional rights, your health rights, intersect with all of this? What are the key policies and legal documents and implications that I should be aware of? Because then the more you start scratching, the more you discover that actually the bigger picture here is that, do we have the correct policies or do we not? Is it an issue at policy making? Is it an issue at policy implementation? Is it at resource level? So to start engaging your mind even at a broader space, I thought it would be important to put that out. I have also shared with you a worksheet that I'll actually show you the picture version of the worksheet in the next slide. But in this worksheet, you will see that according to the different severity levels of hearing loss, it shows you what are some of the things that you can actually practically do in a hearing setting where there's a child with a hearing loss. So this may not necessarily be in a special school. It may be in an area where you have a few children with hearing loss among children with hearing loss. It would completely be different if the situation was in the inverse. And then it also just talks to what are some of the resources that you might need or you might use, or you might even make yourself if you are a DIY kind of a person. So I'll quickly show you the picture version of the worksheet so you know how to navigate the use of the worksheet in your own space. And here is the worksheet. So you will see there are 3 columns, and the first column is on the possible impact on understanding of language and speech. Then there's the possible social impact, and then there's the educational accommodations and services. And above of those headings, you'll see on the row there's a hearing loss, and then there's numbers. Those numbers are attached to the level of hearing loss. So a 16 to 25 decibel hearing loss, that would be a mild hearing loss. And then the further down you go, the worksheet, you'll see the numbers go higher and higher, meaning the severity is going higher and higher. So you will see, for example, under the potential educational accommodation services, they are suggesting methods like favorable seating, meaning you might want to put the child further up front so that the sound travels a lesser distance and has a higher potential of still being at the same volume when it gets to their ears, compared to if they were at the back, then the sound has to travel farther. And for example, you may want to have a hearing aid or a personal FM system, and these are just some of the assistive devices that an audiologist or hearing healthcare professional might be able to recommend for the child. You might have, to look at the acoustic environment of the classroom, for example. Is there background noise that might distract the child from the educational instruction? And so this worksheet takes you through the potential accommodations for each level of the hearing loss, and I've made this available to you, and it is from an article, so it is evidence-based. There's obviously many other resources, but I thought this is a good starting point to illustrate some of the tangible things that you can do in your environment where you don't necessarily need to break the bank to make some of these accommodations. And so I hope this is useful for your environment, and that you're able to begin to see the tip of the iceberg on the amount of just intervention or even support a child with a hearing loss needs to function compared to a child who does not have a hearing loss when they are having to engage learning tasks. And then last, as we come to the conclusion of our session, I thought it might be interesting and also perhaps a engaging exercise for you to also experience a simulated hearing loss. What does that, sound like? What is that experience like? And you can click on that link in your own time and just have a look. And I hope that this encourages you to approach communication with a child with hearing loss with empathy, and also inspire some action towards the advocacy for children with hearing loss, especially in the school setting. Please feel free to email me any questions if you have, or feel free to use the live session that we're going to have to pose questions or to have an opportunity to discuss more and in more in depth with me. I really, really look forward to engaging with you. Thank you so much for your time. In the last slide, I won't narrate over it. You'll just see my email again in case you need to contact me. Thank you so much for your time, and all the best for your experience in the rest of the short course.